He thought she was just a stranger's child, until he saw the gold bracelet on her wrist, the one he gave the woman he left 5 years ago. The early afternoon sun was warm against the glass towers of Manhattan as Henry Carter stepped out of his office building, a phone pressed to his ear and a sleek leather folder tucked under his arm. He looked every bit the part of a successful CEO, his light blue tailored suit perfectly fitted, his dark hair neatly styled, and his piercing blue eyes sharp and focused. He moved with purpose, always in a rush, always calculating his next deal or strategy. That day, however, he wasn't prepared for what was about to disrupt the carefully ordered world he had built. Just as he reached the curb, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the street. It caught the folder in his arm, ripping it open and sending a flurry of papers into the air. Contracts, charts, and confidential documents fluttered like white birds across the sidewalk. Henry let out a frustrated sigh and crouched down, trying to catch as many pages as he could before they were carried off entirely. Then he heard a small voice beside him. "I'll help." Startled, he turned his head and saw a little girl kneeling beside him. She couldn't have been older than 5. Her hair was chestnut brown and tied into 2 bouncy pigtails, and her wide blue eyes, an almost perfect match to his, were filled with determination as she carefully gathered the papers and stacked them in a neat pile. She wore a white t-shirt and a denim jumper dress, her little knees brushing the pavement as she worked with surprising focus and care. Henry blinked, momentarily thrown off. It wasn't every day a stranger, let alone a child, helped him with something so mundane. He offered a polite but warm, "Thank you." The girl grinned up at him and extended the stack of papers. And that's when he saw it. A delicate gold bracelet hung loosely on her small wrist, the chain gleaming faintly in the sun. At first it was just a glint, nothing unusual, but then he saw the charm attached to it. His breath caught. It was an heirloom from his family, one of a kind, with an engraving so distinct he didn't need to read it to recognize it. He had given that bracelet to someone once. A long time ago. To Kate. His world tilted, the sidewalk beneath him suddenly unstable. His gaze darted from the bracelet back to the little girl's eyes. He couldn't form the words at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost uncertain. "Where did you get that bracelet?" The girl looked at him innocently, lifting her wrist as if it were just any other accessory. "My mommy gave it to me. She said it belonged to my daddy." Henry felt the air leave his lungs. The sounds of the city faded into a dull hum. His fingers trembled as he stared at the bracelet, at the little girl holding his documents like it was the most normal thing in the world. And then she smiled again. "My name's Emma." The name hit him harder than any boardroom betrayal or business loss ever had. There was something terrifying and beautiful in the way she stood there, calm and cheerful, completely unaware of the storm she had just unleashed inside him. Henry stood frozen on the sidewalk, still holding the last of the papers Emma had handed him, though he had forgotten about them entirely. The sounds of the city around him, the honking horns, footsteps, passing conversations, faded into a distant blur. All he could focus on was the weight of that one name, the unmistakable charm on that bracelet, and the little girl's innocent voice repeating in his mind, "My mommy gave it to me. She said it belonged to my daddy." Something deep in his chest tightened, something he hadn't felt in years, maybe guilt, maybe fear, maybe hope, though it was tangled and hard to name. He crouched a little to meet her eyes. "Emma Harper?" he asked carefully, needing to be sure. The girl nodded with a bright smile and pointed across the street. "My mom's in there. In the coffee shop. She's getting me a cookie." She beamed as if this were the most exciting part of her day, unaware that her words had just detonated a buried part of Henry's past. His mouth was dry, and for a second, he felt completely unprepared for what he might find inside that cafe. He hadn't seen Kate in 5 years. The last time they spoke, they were both in tears, she was begging him to stay, and he was walking away. She had told him she was pregnant, and he hadn't believed her at first. When she showed him the test, he froze. The terror that gripped him then had nothing to do with the child or even with Kate, it was the fear that he would ruin them both, the way his own father had nearly ruined his family. He had built a life around control, discipline, success, but he didn't know how to be vulnerable, how to be present, how to love without running. So he ran. He thought he was doing the right thing at the time. He thought disappearing would be less cruel than staying and becoming a man he was afraid of becoming. He buried himself in work, changed his number, moved across the city, surrounded himself with the noise of business and status to drown out the echo of her voice in his mind. But she was never really gone. Not a day passed that he didn't think of Kate. He tried to convince himself that she'd moved on, that maybe she'd never actually had the baby, that maybe it had all been a mistake. But now Emma stood in front of him, a living, breathing confirmation of everything he had tried to bury. The same blue eyes. The same tilt of the chin when she smiled. She was his. He rose slowly, the papers forgotten in his hand. His heart pounded as he glanced across the street at the glass door of the coffee shop. He could see silhouettes moving inside. He had no idea what he was going to say, how he was going to explain, or if she would even look at him after all this time. But he had to know. He had to see her. Even if it was too late, even if she hated him, he needed to see Kate again. Emma skipped ahead without waiting, confident and carefree. She pushed open the cafe door and ran toward a woman at the counter. Henry followed, hesitating only for a second before stepping inside. The moment his eyes found her, the noise of the world rushed back in. Kate. She stood near the barista, her profile turned slightly as she looked down into her purse. Her hair was a little longer now, with soft waves instead of the straight cut she used to wear. She wore a light blouse and jeans, nothing glamorous, but she had always carried a kind of quiet beauty that made people look twice. When she turned at the sound of the door and saw him, her eyes locked onto his, and everything around them seemed to vanish. For a long second, neither of them moved. It was as if they were caught in time, suspended between past and present. Her lips parted slightly, her expression shifting from confusion to recognition to disbelief. "Henry," she said, barely above a whisper. He nodded, trying to find words but failing. He hadn't prepared for this. Nothing could have prepared him for this. Kate's gaze dropped instinctively to Emma, who had already begun happily explaining how she'd helped a man outside and how he knew her name and her bracelet. Henry saw the moment it clicked in Kate's eyes, the moment she realized who he was, what this meant. He stepped forward slowly. "Is she mine?" he asked, his voice cracked and raw from the emotion. Kate was silent for a moment, her hand resting protectively on Emma's shoulder. Then she looked at him, really looked at him, and said quietly, "Yes. Her name is Emma. She's your daughter." Henry's knees felt weak. It was everything he had once been afraid of, and everything he had secretly hoped to hear. Kate sat down at a small table near the window, her fingers wrapped tightly around the edge of a coffee cup she hadn't even sipped from. Her eyes hadn't left Henry since the moment she realized who he was. The weight of his presence was overwhelming, and it felt like the past 5 years had folded in on themselves, bringing back a rush of emotions she had worked so hard to bury: anger, sadness, disbelief, and somewhere deep underneath it all, a flicker of something she didn't want to name yet. Henry sat across from her, visibly shaken, his usually composed and confident demeanor stripped away. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain. Human. Emma was seated beside her mother, humming quietly to herself as she played with a sugar packet, blissfully unaware of the storm unraveling between the two adults. Kate kept her hand gently resting on her daughter's back, like an anchor grounding her in the moment. Henry, on the other hand, looked like a man who had been tossed into the middle of a life he had never expected to find. He tried to speak, but the words came out awkwardly. "Kate. I don't even know where to begin." She let out a soft, incredulous laugh, not out of humor, but because she genuinely didn't know how to process the fact that he was suddenly here, sitting in front of her after disappearing without a trace 5 years ago. "Try the beginning," she said, her voice steady but cold. "Or try explaining why you left when I needed you most." Henry leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, fingers laced together like he was bracing himself. "I was scared," he admitted. "I know that sounds weak. I know it doesn't excuse anything. But I panicked. When you told me you were pregnant, something broke inside me. I kept hearing my father's voice, all the ways he failed us, all the ways he damaged everything he touched. I thought if I stayed, I would end up hurting you. Hurting her. I thought leaving was protecting you." Kate shook her head slowly, bitter disbelief flashing in her eyes. "You disappeared, Henry. No calls. No messages. You changed your number. I thought something had happened to you. Then I realized, nothing had happened. You just chose to disappear." Her voice cracked slightly, and she quickly composed herself. Henry looked down at the table, unable to meet her eyes. "I looked for you," he said quietly. "After a while. When I started to realize what I'd done. I went to your apartment and it was empty. I tried to reach out, but you were gone. There was no trace of you anywhere." Kate tightened her grip on the coffee cup. "I moved. I had to. I couldn't raise a child in the same place where everything reminded me of being abandoned. I didn't want Emma to grow up feeling like she was some mistake." "She's not," Henry said quickly, lifting his head. His voice was sharp now, filled with regret and conviction. "She's not a mistake. I didn't know what to do then, but I know now. I want to be part of her life. If you'll let me." Kate stared at him, her expression unreadable. Part of her wanted to scream, to demand why now, why after all this time, after all the tears and lonely nights, after watching Emma learn to walk and talk and grow up without ever knowing who her father was. But another part of her saw something different in Henry's eyes, something she hadn't seen before: vulnerability. Not the carefully rehearsed charm she used to fall for, not the ambition or pride. This was a man broken by guilt, desperate for a second chance. It didn't make everything okay, but it made it real. Emma looked up at that moment, as if sensing the shift in the air. "Are you mad, Mommy?" she asked in a small voice. Kate smiled softly and brushed a hand through her daughter's hair. "No, baby. Just surprised." Henry swallowed hard and looked at his daughter, really looked at her, not just the features she had inherited from him, but the warmth, the lightness, the life he had missed out on. "Hi, Emma," he said gently. "I'm Henry. I'm your dad." Emma tilted her head, curious but unafraid. "You look like me," she said, and Henry let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost a sob. Kate watched the moment with a strange, aching tightness in her chest. She wasn't ready to forgive, not yet, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel completely alone. There was a storm coming, no doubt, but something had shifted in the air, like the first clear light after days of rain. The hours passed slowly after that first meeting. Kate had given Henry her number, though she hesitated before doing so, as if handing it over meant unlocking a door she had long ago sealed shut. Henry didn't press her for anything more that day, he didn't ask for explanations or forgiveness. Instead, he simply asked if he could see Emma again. Kate didn't give an answer right away. She just nodded once, not out of agreement, but out of exhaustion. Everything about seeing him again had drained her, pulled her back into memories she'd buried so deeply she sometimes forgot they were still alive inside her. In the days that followed, Kate kept things quiet. She needed space to think, to breathe, to sort through the avalanche of emotion that had come crashing down around her. For years, she had built a life that didn't include Henry. She had become a mother alone. She had worked 2 jobs, rocked Emma to sleep during teething nights, sat beside her during fevers and doctor appointments, helped her learn to read and tie her shoes. She had watched Emma grow into a curious, kind-hearted, brilliant little girl who had never once asked why she didn't have a father, at least not until recently. And even then, Kate had answered vaguely, buying time with gentle lies like, "He lives far away," or, "It's complicated." Now she was standing face to face with those lies. Now the man who had left her to figure it all out on her own was back, asking for a place in a life that had moved on without him. The hardest part was that Kate could see he wasn't the same man who had walked away 5 years ago. That version of Henry had been sharp, guarded, too confident for his own good. He hadn't known how to share space with another person, how to admit fear, how to stay. But the man who sat across from her in that coffee shop, the one who had held Emma's hand like it was the most delicate thing in the world, was different. He looked older. Not just physically, but emotionally. There was something raw in his eyes now, something stripped down, like he'd been broken and rebuilt in the years they'd been apart. Eventually, Kate agreed to let them meet again, but only in small, controlled ways. She invited him to the park where she and Emma liked to spend Saturday mornings. He arrived early and brought a bag of pastries, unsure of what Emma liked but hopeful that croissants were a safe bet. Emma ran to him with the same open-hearted energy she gave to everyone she trusted, and Henry looked overwhelmed as he crouched down to hug her, like he couldn't quite believe this was real. At first, Kate stood back and observed. She watched how Henry listened when Emma talked about her favorite cartoon characters, how he knelt down to her level and asked questions instead of offering answers, how he laughed when she told a silly joke and didn't look at his phone once. These were small things, but they mattered to her. She had seen too many men walk through the lives of women and children with a sense of obligation, as though presence alone earned them affection. But Henry wasn't acting out of guilt, at least not entirely. He seemed to genuinely enjoy being with Emma, to soak in every minute like it was something precious. After a few weeks of visits to the park, Kate let him come over for dinner. She was cautious, but Emma had begun asking about him more and more. When will Daddy come again? Or, can he see my drawings? Kate couldn't deny her daughter something that was clearly making her so happy, even if it scared her to hope. Henry arrived with a bouquet of flowers, white daisies, which Kate had once told him she liked during a lazy afternoon years ago. She was surprised he remembered. She made pasta while Emma showed off her bedroom, her books, her growing collection of stuffed animals. Henry followed her from room to room with a kind of reverence, like he was walking through a museum of moments he had missed. Later, while Emma was brushing her teeth and getting ready for bed, Henry and Kate sat at the kitchen table, the air between them quiet but not cold. He looked around the small apartment, the photos taped to the fridge, the coloring books on the floor, the soft hum of a home that had lived without him, and said, "You did all this on your own." Kate didn't respond right away. She wasn't used to acknowledgement, let alone praise. Eventually, she looked at him and said, "I had to." Henry nodded slowly, swallowing whatever words he might have said next. Then he whispered, "I'm sorry." The silence that followed was heavier than before, but not suffocating. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people are learning to exist in the same space again, cautiously, like walking barefoot over glass. Kate didn't forgive him that night. She wasn't sure if she was ready. But she let him read Emma a bedtime story, standing quietly in the hallway while his voice carried through the half-open door. She watched him stumble over a few of the funnier lines, heard Emma giggle, and felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was something like warmth. As she turned off the kitchen light later that night, she realized that Henry hadn't just returned for Emma. He had returned to face everything he'd run from, and that was something she never thought he'd do. Whether that would be enough, she didn't know. But for the first time since he left, she wasn't just a single mother trying to survive the wreckage of abandonment. She was a woman standing at the edge of something new, something terrifying, uncertain, and maybe, just maybe, full of possibility. Over the following weeks, Henry became a steady presence in Emma's life. What had begun as cautious meetings in the park slowly transformed into routines. He would pick her up from preschool once or twice a week and take her for ice cream, or spend Sunday afternoons helping her assemble puzzles on the living room floor. He was careful, never overstepping, never assuming too much. And Kate watched it all with a cautious heart, standing between awe and anxiety as she observed the slow, deliberate way her daughter began to open her arms wider to the man who had once been only a name spoken in hushed, uncertain tones. Henry seemed determined not to miss anything now. He took mental notes of Emma's favorite songs, her bedtime rituals, the way she liked her sandwiches cut diagonally instead of straight. He started carrying crayons and a tiny notebook in his briefcase, just in case he had to entertain her on the fly. He adjusted meetings to be available for school events, sat in tiny chairs at parent-teacher nights, and even learned to braid doll hair, a skill he approached with a seriousness that made Kate smile in spite of herself. Still, trust wasn't something Kate gave freely anymore. She found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much she could allow herself to believe in this version of Henry. Was this real? Was it lasting? Or was it a temporary storm of guilt dressed up as devotion? Part of her longed to believe he had truly changed, that he had grown, evolved, and returned not out of obligation but out of love. But there was another part, smaller but louder in the dark, that whispered he could leave again just as quickly as he had before. Kate had spent too long building a life that functioned without him. She had learned how to budget every dollar, how to fix a broken sink, how to soothe Emma's fears in the night without calling anyone for help. The idea of needing someone again, of relying on Henry not just as Emma's father but as a partner, a fixture in their lives, was terrifying. She knew what it felt like to be left behind, and she couldn't risk putting her daughter through that a second time. One rainy Wednesday, they all ended up in Kate's apartment for dinner. The original plan had been to meet at a diner, but the storm had turned the sidewalks into rivers. Henry arrived soaked through, his umbrella turned inside out and his hair plastered to his forehead. Kate laughed when she saw him, genuinely laughed, and handed him a towel without thinking. Emma was ecstatic to have him there. She tugged him into the living room and showed him her new art project, a cardboard rocket ship painted in neon colors. Henry crouched beside her and admired every brushstroke as if it belonged in a gallery. Then, as Kate set the table, she overheard Emma asking him, "Are you going to stay forever this time?" There was a pause. Kate froze in the kitchen, listening. Henry didn't rush the answer. Instead, he said, "I hope so, Em. I really do." His voice cracked just a little, and when Kate glanced over, she saw him pull Emma gently into his arms. Her daughter leaned into him without hesitation. Later that night, after Emma had gone to bed and the dishes were done, Kate found herself sitting beside Henry on the couch, the quiet of the apartment wrapping around them like a shared memory. She didn't say anything at first. Neither did he. The television was off, the lights were dim, and the only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, she asked, "Do you ever think about what it would have been like, if you hadn't left?" Henry exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together before replying. "Every day. I think about every birthday I missed. Every morning I didn't get to make pancakes. Every scraped knee I didn't get to kiss better. I can't take that back. I wish I could. But I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." Kate looked at him for a long moment. Part of her wanted to believe it. Part of her already did, but the scar was still there, thin and quiet but not forgotten. "You hurt me," she said softly. "Not just by leaving. But by not even trying to come back until now." He nodded. "I know. And I'll keep showing up, every day, if that's what it takes. I'll earn it. I don't expect you to trust me just because I say the right things. I'm not here for a second chance with you unless you want that. I'm here because I love her. And, because I never stopped loving you." The words hung between them, fragile but real. Kate didn't respond right away. She looked down at her hands and then at the hallway where Emma was sleeping. For the first time in years, her world felt unbalanced, not from loss, but from the sudden possibility of something healing. When she finally spoke, her voice was tired but steady. "I don't know what this is going to look like. I don't know if I can ever really trust you the way I did before." Henry nodded again. "That's okay. I'll wait. As long as it takes." And somehow, those words didn't feel like a promise wrapped in hope. They felt like something else entirely, a quiet vow that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to something that resembled a family. Spring came quietly that year, melting the last of the snow and replacing the gray streets with soft blooms and budding trees. By then, Henry had become a more regular figure in Kate and Emma's life. His visits were no longer awkward interruptions, they were part of a routine that had slowly grown around them like ivy on old brick. He had learned to navigate Emma's moods, to anticipate when she needed comfort and when she needed space. He had even started helping with drop-offs at school on occasion, which Kate didn't openly acknowledge, but she noticed that Emma walked taller on those mornings, smiling just a little brighter when she waved goodbye. It was during one of these mornings that Emma asked Henry if he would come to her school's spring garden celebration. It was a yearly event filled with flowers, student performances, and cheerful chaos, exactly the kind of thing he had missed year after year. She handed him a crumpled invitation with her name written in careful block letters, and Henry pressed it to his chest like a medal. He promised he'd be there. The day of the celebration, the school grounds were filled with rows of folding chairs, pastel decorations, and the scent of blooming tulips planted by the students weeks earlier. Henry arrived early, holding a small bouquet of yellow daffodils. He looked over the crowd nervously, scanning for familiar faces. Kate and Emma arrived together a few minutes later, Emma bouncing with excitement in her white dress and a paper flower crown. When she saw Henry, she ran to him without hesitation, wrapping her arms around his waist and beaming up at him. Kate followed at a slower pace, nodding a quiet hello to Henry. She wasn't cold, not anymore, but she still kept a certain space between them that neither of them tried to cross too quickly. She stood beside him during the event, close enough to hear his comments about the children's songs, but far enough that they didn't accidentally brush arms. The celebration was everything it promised to be, messy, sweet, and full of heart. Emma's class sang a slightly off-key but utterly charming rendition of "You Are My Sunshine," and Henry's eyes welled up halfway through. He didn't try to hide it. Kate noticed and said nothing, but she tucked that image away, a quiet marker of how much he had changed. After the songs and performances, the crowd moved toward the refreshment tables. That's when it happened. Henry was standing with Emma near the juice and cookies, talking to one of the other parents, when Kate overheard two women nearby whispering. She wasn't trying to listen, but the words came sharp and clear. "That's him, right? The dad who left before she was even born. 5 years? Seriously? Some men don't deserve to come back." Kate froze, her body suddenly tense. She turned slightly, just enough to see the women glancing toward Henry and Emma with subtle disapproval masked as polite curiosity. Kate wanted to say something, to shut it down with a single look or a firm sentence, but before she could move, she noticed Emma. Her daughter had heard it too. Emma stood completely still, her cup of juice in one hand, her eyes wide and blinking up at Henry with something like confusion and hurt. The brightness had drained from her face, and when Henry turned to ask if she wanted another cookie, she barely answered. Later, in the car on the way home, Emma didn't sing along to the radio like she usually did. She just stared out the window. When they got home, she went straight to her room. Kate followed a few minutes later and found her sitting on the edge of her bed, still wearing her flower crown. "Sweetheart," Kate said gently, sitting beside her, "what's wrong?" Emma turned to her slowly, her voice small. "Those ladies said Daddy didn't want me. That he left." Kate's heart cracked wide open. She took a long breath, trying to steady the rush of anger and protectiveness that surged through her. "They don't know the whole story," she said softly. People sometimes say things when they don't understand. But you know what? What matters is what you see. What you feel. Emma looked down. Did he really leave? Kate didn't want to lie, but the truth was fragile. She put her arm around Emma's shoulders. Yes. A long time ago. Before you were born. But not because of you. Never because of you. Emma was quiet for a moment. Why did he come back? Kate paused, brushing a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. Because he realized how much he missed. Because he loves you. There was another long pause. Then Emma stood up and walked out of the room. Kate followed slowly, uncertain what would come next. She found Henry sitting on the couch, clearly troubled, sensing something was wrong but not knowing what. Emma walked right up to him and climbed into his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Do you love me?" she asked, her voice muffled in his shoulder. Henry held her tightly, his eyes already glistening. "More than anything, Emma. Always. Even when I wasn't born yet?" Henry kissed the top of her head. "Even then." Kate stood silently at the edge of the room, watching them. She saw the way Henry held their daughter, not as someone trying to make up for the past, but as someone who finally understood what love meant, the kind that didn't just show up when it was easy, but stayed when it was hard. That night, after Emma went to bed, Kate sat beside Henry and finally spoke. "She heard them," she said. "The other parents. She heard what they said about you." Henry nodded slowly. "I thought maybe she had. She looked different after." Kate looked at him, her voice low. "You handled it well." He shook his head. "I didn't handle anything. She did." Kate didn't argue. Instead, she looked down at her hands, then back at him. "You're becoming someone she can count on. That's not something I say lightly." Henry turned to her, his expression soft, surprised. "Thank you." Kate gave a small, tired smile. "Don't thank me. Just keep showing up." And he did. The weeks following the garden celebration unfolded with a kind of quiet rhythm that Kate hadn't expected. Something had shifted, not dramatically, but with the slow, careful movement of something real taking root. Henry didn't speak often about what happened that day, not about the gossiping parents, not about Emma's question, not about the moment she had climbed into his arms and asked him if he loved her. But Kate knew it had changed him. She saw it in the way he looked at Emma now, with a tenderness laced with something deeper, like reverence. She saw it in the way he spoke less about what he had missed and more about what he was grateful to witness now, her laugh, her quirks, the way she said, "spaghetti," like it had 3 more syllables than it actually did. Henry had stopped trying to prove himself, and perhaps that was the biggest change of all. In the beginning, he had been so focused on demonstrating his commitment that he often felt like a man on stage, constantly auditioning for forgiveness. But now he had settled into a role that didn't need applause. He was simply there. He showed up. He listened. He followed through on his promises. When he said he would be somewhere, he was. When Emma asked for something, he made an effort. And when Kate needed space, he respected it without question. One evening, a few days into May, the 3 of them took a walk through the neighborhood park. The sky was a hazy lavender, the air thick with the smell of fresh-cut grass and blooming lilacs. Emma rode ahead on her scooter, her helmet slightly crooked, legs pumping with determined speed as she called back over her shoulder for them to catch up. Henry walked beside Kate in a comfortable silence, their hands brushing once or twice but never quite finding the courage to stay together. Kate glanced at him as they turned a corner, past a quiet row of benches and lilac trees. "You've changed," she said suddenly, not looking at him, but letting the words drift between them. He looked over, surprised by her voice, then softened. "I've had to." She nodded. "But not just because of her. Because of you." Henry was quiet for a moment, then stopped walking. Emma had already zipped around the next bend, out of sight but within calling distance. He turned to face Kate. The truth is, I was running from who I was. From everything I didn't want to become. I was terrified I'd turn into my father. Or worse, that I'd hurt the people I loved just by being in their lives. But when I left, I did exactly that. I hurt you both. Kate looked at him, not with bitterness, but with a kind of worn understanding that had taken years to form. You did, she said, steady. And for a long time, I didn't think I could forgive you. Not because I hated you, but because I was afraid I'd never stop waiting for you to leave again. Henry's expression faltered, and for a second, he looked like the young man who had walked away from her all those years ago, scared, ashamed, vulnerable. But then he straightened his shoulders, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was creased and worn, the ink fading at the edges. He handed it to her. Kate opened it and saw a hand-drawn map, crude, childlike lines marking roads and stick figures. At the bottom was a note in uneven handwriting. Asterisk, this is the way to my heart. Love, Emma. Asterisk. Kate stared at it for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. Her eyes burned with tears she didn't want to let fall. She gave you this? Henry nodded. Last week. After I fixed her robot. She said if I ever got lost again, I'd know how to find my way back. Kate laughed softly, one hand covering her mouth. She's something else. She's you, Henry said, without hesitation. Your strength, your kindness, your spirit. I'm just grateful she still had room for me in there too. There was a long pause, and then Kate stepped forward. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She reached for his hand and held it, not fleetingly this time, but deliberately, letting her fingers curl into his. They stood there like that as the light faded around them, their daughter's laughter echoing through the trees. It wasn't forgiveness wrapped in a speech or a dramatic reunion. It was simple. Honest. Two people who had been broken in different ways choosing to build something new, together, in the quiet truth of the present. Later that night, when Henry helped tuck Emma into bed, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes and asked, "Is Mommy still mad at you?" Henry smiled and brushed her hair back. Not mad. Just healing. Emma nodded like she understood more than a 5-year-old should. Healing is like when I fall and Mommy kisses it better. He kissed her forehead and whispered, exactly like that. When he stepped back into the hallway, Kate was waiting. She didn't speak. She just looked at him for a moment, then quietly said, "Maybe we could try again. Not just for her. For us." Henry felt the breath leave his lungs. He had waited 5 years to hear those words. And in that moment, with all the pain, regret, love, and hope between them, he understood something he hadn't before: redemption doesn't come all at once. It comes in moments. In late-night talks, in quiet forgiveness, in small hands drawing maps back to hearts that were never really lost. The morning of the wedding dawned with a gentle kind of light, the kind that slips in softly through curtains and makes everything feel quieter, more sacred. It wasn't a grand affair, no towering venues, no photographers bustling around, no crowds of distant relatives or over-polished speeches. It was small, intentional, and deeply personal. Just family, a few close friends, and the promise of something reclaimed rather than newly made. They held the ceremony in the backyard of Kate's parents' house, a space that had watched Emma grow from a baby into the brave, expressive little girl she was now. It had once been a place where Kate had hidden from the world during the darkest days of single motherhood, and now it was transformed into something bright and living again. Kate stood by her bedroom window that morning, her reflection framed in the glass. Her dress wasn't extravagant, soft ivory, simple lines, something she had chosen for how it felt rather than how it impressed. She had never been one for fairy tale weddings. Reality had always mattered more. Love had to be earned, proven, weathered, and Henry had done all of that and more. She adjusted a small gold locket around her neck, one that now held two pictures, one of Emma, and one of her and Henry on the day they had taken Emma to the zoo, laughing under the rain. Outside, Emma twirled in a pale blue dress that brushed her knees, her hair in matching braids tied with white ribbon. She took her role as the ring-bearer very seriously, holding the tiny white satin pillow with both hands, her brow furrowed with concentration. Henry stood at the other end of the yard, nervous in a way Kate had never seen before. He wore a light gray suit, no tie, just an open collar and a small white flower pinned near his heart. His hands fidgeted, not with worry about the ceremony itself, but with the overwhelming emotion of what it all meant. For a man who had once run from everything that mattered, today was proof that he had stayed. The ceremony was simple. There was no music except the quiet wind brushing through the trees, and no spoken vows beyond the ones they wrote themselves. Kate read hers first, her voice steady but filled with emotion, thanking Henry not for being perfect, but for returning, for standing in the mess with her and not looking away. She thanked him for the nights he read Emma stories, for the mornings he showed up without being asked, for the apologies he never rushed her to accept. She thanked him for learning how to be someone they could both trust. Henry's vows were quieter, almost whispered, and he barely made it through without his voice cracking. He didn't speak in grand declarations. Instead, he said the small things that meant everything, that he would be the one to fix the loose cupboard door, to bring soup when she was sick, to listen when she was tired of speaking. That he would never again disappear, no matter how afraid he became. And most of all, that he would never stop choosing them, every single day. When it was time for the rings, Emma stepped forward, carrying the pillow with a carefulness that made everyone smile. She looked up at Henry and then at Kate, and for a brief moment, Kate could see the enormity of the moment register in her daughter's eyes. It wasn't just about marriage. It was about a family being mended in real time. Henry reached into his pocket and took out a small velvet box. From it, he pulled a bracelet, delicate gold, carefully restored. It was the same bracelet Kate had given Emma years ago, the one Henry had seen that very first day, scattered among flying papers and chance. But now it had been altered. The original charm was still there, engraved with the Carter family crest, but new ones had been added, an E for Emma and a small silver heart with a blue stone in the center. He handed it to Kate before turning to Emma. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said softly. "Then it was your mother's. Now it's yours. Not just because it's old or beautiful, but because it carries our story. Everything we've been through, everything we're building. This is your legacy." Emma stared at the bracelet for a long moment, then reached out and let him clasp it around her wrist. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. She looked up at him with eyes so full of trust that Henry nearly lost his breath. After the ceremony, there was food and laughter under string lights. Kate's father gave a toast that made everyone laugh through their tears, and Emma ran around barefoot, her blue dress dirt-streaked and her cheeks flushed from joy. At one point, Kate and Henry slipped away to the far edge of the yard, just for a moment of stillness. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, and for a long time, they didn't speak. Then she said quietly, "I didn't think this day would ever come." Henry kissed her temple and answered, "Neither did I. But I never stopped hoping." And that was the truth. Theirs wasn't a story about perfect beginnings or flawless timing. It was about second chances, and about the kind of love that grows not despite the storms, but because of them. They had built something strong in the ruins of what had once been broken. As the night deepened and stars began to shimmer overhead, Emma danced between the guests with the bracelet glinting on her wrist, a golden thread tying the past to the present. She wore it not just as a piece of jewelry, but as a symbol of everything her parents had fought for, lost, and found again. And in that quiet, glowing night, they were not just a couple who had once fallen apart. They were a family, imperfect, healing, and real. Together. This story's ending isn't just satisfying, it feels earned. It doesn't rely on fantasy or grand redemption arcs but instead on something far more powerful, the slow, often painful process of rebuilding trust. What makes it resonate is how grounded it is in emotional truth. There's no magical fix for abandonment, no sweeping forgiveness after a few nice gestures. Kate doesn't instantly forgive, and Henry doesn't expect her to. Instead, their reunion is marked by consistency, vulnerability, and a quiet commitment to do better, not for appearances, but for each other and for Emma. The bracelet, once a symbol of what was lost, becomes a thread that ties their past to their present, and ultimately to their future. Giving it to Emma isn't just a gesture, it's a passing of legacy, of responsibility, and of love that has endured its worst trial and survived. The real beauty of the ending lies in its imperfection. It leaves us with the feeling that this family, though once broken, is now whole, not because everything is resolved, but because they've chosen each other again, fully and honestly. It's a love story, yes, but more than that, it's a story about growth, consequence, and hope that doesn't just promise, it shows.